Andrew Jackson. And we call it the Jacksonian era because there is something that's going to occur here that's going to dramatically change American politics. And part of it's because of what happens before Jackson's elected, and part of it's because of what happens while Jackson is president. The essential question you see on the screen is the question that I think, regardless of whether I've asked you to answer this question in class, this essential question really is the one you should be focusing on. And that is, does he really support the common man? Now, to understand that, you have to understand what the common man is. For Jackson, the common man means the average person. It does not mean the super rich. It does not mean the poor. The poor will always be with us, we're told, and the super rich will always be there. But we're not talking about them, because the people that are in between the rich and the poor, they make up a vast majority of the population. They are what we call the middle class. They go to work every day, or they do some work every day, and they try and make ends meet. They might struggle along, or they might be doing rather successfully and be very comfortable. But the thing is that they are in the middle. They're not the rich, they're not the poor. Does he really support those people? And the question is, maybe more specifically, what do those people look like? Male, female, white, black, other races besides those? That's a good question. But this is the way we want to phrase the question at the time. I think it's safe to assume that the common man would be the average person, white, free American citizen, obviously not a slave, obviously not an immigrant, but obviously not an Indian. But that's what we mean by the common man. We're going to start our story with the election of 1824. And the election of 1824 is a very controversial election. Now, as much as you see some bullet points here, don't go running ahead, because there's more to write down than even the blanks you see here. There's an awful lot in this particular story that's really, really important, because it'll help us understand why it is that Jackson gets elected. There are a total of 4 candidates in 1824. And because there are 4 candidates, the vote for the election is going to get split 4 different ways. And so no one wins a majority of the electoral votes in the election of 1824, and the election ends up in the House of Representatives. Now, so far, what I've said should be, I think, very obvious to students in my class. This is what happens. There are occasions where the election doesn't end up with a decision, and then we end up in the House of Representatives. We remember, if you think back to the election of 1800, we had a similar problem where there was a tie, and it went to the House of Representatives, and they had to work out their problems there. Only took them 36 times to do it, but they worked them out. Well, John Quincy Adams is one of those 4, and so is, of course, Andrew Jackson. And when it goes to the House of Representatives, John Quincy Adams makes a deal with Henry Clay, and Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House. Now, so far, what we have is the following. We have, of course, Andrew Jackson, and Andrew Jackson is running for president. We have John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams is running for president. Well, we happen to have that guy, Henry Clay, and Henry Clay is running for president, and another guy, Mr. Crawford, is also running for president. Well, we can cross him out because he ends up breaking his leg during the election and drops out, although his name is on the ballot. He gets some of the electoral votes, but he's really not a contender. So again, here we are in the House of Representatives, and John Quincy Adams goes to Henry Clay and says, hey, Henry Clay, if you do me a favor and get me to be president, then I will, well, if you can get me to be president, then I will appoint you to be Secretary of State. And Henry Clay's like, what, really? So if I drop out, get people basically that would have supported me to vote for you, and you get me to be Secretary of State, which is what you, John Quincy Adams, used to be before you became president. Which means someday I get to be president, I think. So Henry Clay is, well, yeah, this is certainly a good idea for me. Well, this becomes known as what's called the corrupt bargain. Sort of a backroom deal. And that is that people really don't like the fact that there's this kind of wheeling and dealing going on in the House of Representatives to choose the president, when really it's something that the people would like to have more based on what they say and what they would like to have happen. And they were really hoping that their representatives would have done exactly that. So when Jackson lost, people got angry. And the reason is he had received more popular vote and more electoral vote than any candidate, even John Quincy Adams, and yet he wasn't chosen president. So if you look at the chart here, we notice that Jackson is in green, and Jackson receives 38% of the electoral vote. He receives 43% of the popular vote, and yet he ends up being nothing in terms of an elected official. John Quincy Adams instead wins. And John Quincy Adams was sitting there at 32% compared to his 38%, 31% compared to his 43% of popular vote. Jackson was an extremely popular person, just not popular enough to get enough electoral votes. And this is why his people are very angry. His supporters are going to demand in those 4 years during John Quincy Adams' presidency, people in states, all over the United States, are going to begin to demand, and many of them are Jackson supporters, that they have greater control over who is chosen to run for president. In other words, that nomination process. How do we figure out who is it that gets nominated to be president and then therefore runs for president for each political party? If you remember, in the election of 2016, we essentially had 2, at times 3, Democratic candidates, but we had as many as 12 Republican candidates, and I think at one time we had 16. So how do we get from our 16 or our 12 to 1? What's the process? Well, during that, between 1824 and 1828, during those 4 years of John Quincy Adams' presidency, people are going to demand more control over the nomination process, how it is that people are chosen to run for president and ultimately end up on the ballot so that people can vote on them. Now, that's not as much of a big deal. It's really something that's going to change over time, over many, many decades, that process. But even more so, an important point here is that voting laws are going to change. Now, before really 1824, typically, if you were white, male, 21 years old, and you owned land, you could vote. Well, in 1824, there was beginning to be a push in most states, and states began to change their rules. And now you had to be white, male, 21 years old in American says, but you don't have to own land. That land requirement disappeared, which means that there are tens of thousands of people all across the United States, or perhaps more, perhaps as many as hundreds of thousands, but they are going to get to vote for the very first time. And what kind of people are they? They're middle-class people. They're average people. They are the common man. They're not the wealthy. Because they would have owned land, not the poor. They very often, the poorest of people aren't going to make the effort to vote in the first place because of the fact that they're too consumed with other things, and that is trying to survive. But all those people that don't own land, all of a sudden, they can vote. And boy, in the next election, they're going to make sure that they do, and they're going to vote for Andrew Jackson. So this whole idea, these changes that occur, because of the fact that Jackson got more electoral votes and more popular votes, the changes in the voting laws, for instance, this is what we refer to as Jacksonian democracy. So even when he loses, he has an impact on society, in a sense. Now, in the election of 1828, things changed dramatically. Jackson wants to separate himself from the other candidates. If you notice back in the previous election, notice that it says there are no political parties. Everybody's the same political party. That's weird. But remember, after the War of 1812, the Federalists disappeared. The Republicans were in power. They kind of changed their name a little bit. They called themselves National Republicans. Okay, but the thing is everyone's pretty much from the same political party. Well, then in 1828, Jackson wants to do something very different. He wants to separate himself from all these other people. And so he calls himself a Democrat. He calls himself, he says, I'm part of this new party, the Democratic Party. And so notice on this chart, Jacksonian Democrat, Jackson, and we have the National Republican. we really have the birth of the Democratic Party as we know it today. And Jackson is going to be the first candidate of the Democratic Party. And look what happens in 1828. There's what we call a landslide. This is an overwhelming victory for Jackson. You've got to wonder about the Adams family. John Adams, Alien Sedition Acts, one term. You know, when you mess with people's rights, that happens. John Quincy Adams, one term. Why? Well, backroom deals, behind the scenes, don't involve the people. Certainly doesn't look good. That's why perhaps one term. But also remember, the change in the voting laws means a lot more people are voting, and the result is they're going to vote for Jackson because they're the common man. So Jackson easily wins because of those changes in the voting laws. He easily wins because of the fact that people perceive John Quincy Adams as being somewhat corrupt, although his presidency really isn't, going to be marred or scarred by any kind of big scandal or something. It's really that initial win in the election of 1824. But this is why Jackson easily wins this particular election and goes on to become president in 1828. The spoil system. Now the spoil system is kind of a side note, but it's important to understand that after winning the presidency, Jackson gave government jobs to his supporters. And why did he do this? Well, he did this because his supporters had worked so hard and he could not pay them during the election for the hard work that they did to get him elected. So he did it as a reward to his supporters. He wanted to give them something to show his appreciation. Government jobs are highly treasured. They're jobs that tend to pay very well. They have very good benefits today. And on top of it, it's kind of hard to lose a government job. Once you got it, getting kicked out is pretty rare. And today, almost incredibly hard to have happen to you. So he did this to make sure that when the government workers, when these government workers that are working in the government underneath him as president, that when they make decisions, when they are speaking for the government, that they did what Jackson wanted. Look, he wants them to be his supporters. And what he knows about these government jobs, these government positions, these government workers, is that many of them, prior to him, were appointed by and hired by John Quincy Adams, by the previous president. Well, are they going to be supportive of Jackson? Are they going to follow Jackson's line of thinking when he does certain things? Of course not. They didn't agree with him in the first place. The guy that hired them was the previous president. I mean, can you imagine? Here it is, 2017. And Donald Trump knows that there are thousands of people that work in the government that were actually appointed by and hired by Barack Obama. Can he trust them? Are they going to support him in what he does? There's a good chance they're not going to. And so Jackson is going to begin to pull people out of those positions and fire them, put his supporters in there to make sure that when he makes decisions, when he wants things done, that these people are supporting what he did, what he asked for, and what he wanted to do. These people are called bureaucrats. They work in what's called the bureaucracy. It's a term that it comes from Latin that basically refers to that mass of government employees that they're doing the business of government under the direction of those that are elected by the people. Now, there's this other issue, and that's the kitchen cabinet. And that is that Jackson invites friends, very close friends of his, to meet with him on a regular basis. And they're going to meet with him to discuss politics. So he's going to bounce ideas off these people. Now, these people are not elected. They're not part of his cabinet. They're just friends of Jackson. They're going to meet in the kitchen to eat the really good food that I'm sure the White House serves. And probably to drink some good Tennessee whiskey, because Jackson's from Tennessee. And they're going to throw around ideas and laugh and have fun. And this is what becomes referred to as Jackson's kitchen cabinet. Now again, what you see here, again, the spoil system. To the victor, to the person who wins the election, that person gets the spoils. And what are the spoils of government? Spoils of government are government jobs. They're government contracts. They're business with the government. And these are the things that Jackson's going to use to kind of solidify, to reinforce his presidency, to make sure that when he wants something done, It gets done just the way he wants because he's got this crowd of people around him, whether they are official, they're bureaucrats, or they're unofficial, they're part of the kitchen cabinet. These people are supporting what he's doing. Jackson's first big issue, his first main problem that's going to really kind of test his ability as president, is called the tariff of abominations. Now let's review real quick. A tariff we know is a tax on imports, and this is a nice little example that kind of gives you an idea of how this works. What if an American-made bolt of cloth, meaning a roll of cloth, cost $4, and a British bolt of cloth, a roll of cloth, also costs $4? Well, which one would you buy? Well, you might say, well, I'll buy the American one. The shipping's got to be less. And that would be true. But what if you didn't have any money? Which one would you buy? You probably think, well, you can't buy something when you don't have money. Well, in the South, they can. See, in the South, they're growing the cotton that is needed to make the cloth. And they're going to use the cotton as barter, as trade with England to get the cloth sent to them. And that's how the South does business, is they're using their cotton as cash, as currency, to get credit, essentially. Well, when this tariff hits the United States, it causes British cloth to become more expensive than American cloth. So in this picture, for instance, you see that the cloth goes up to $5. And of course, now the people in the South are thinking, well, do I spend the $5 or do I spend the $4? The problem still is, I don't have money to buy the $4 cloth. And again, I don't even have the money to buy the $5 cloth. So what am I going to do? Well, the result, it really is something that is amazing. And that is, we have an incident in our country known as the tariff of abominations that's going to dramatically affect our country and test the President of the United States. The purpose of this tariff was to protect American businesses. It meant that when the tariff passed, Americans were more likely to buy American cloth than they were British cloth. And that was the point. But the problem is, most of this American cloth is produced in the North, in those northern factories. And the Southerners now are forced to buy that with cash, which means they have to sell their cotton no longer to the British, but they're going to sell their cotton to the northern factories. And they're going to be paid in cash, and they have to send that cash right back to those northern factories to buy cloth. So it's a protective tariff that favors northern businesses, and it hurts the South. And it hurts the South because now they have to totally change the way they do business, and it will end up costing them more money in the long run. They were making a great deal of profit off their sale of cotton to the British. They are not going to make that kind of profit off the sale of their cotton to the northern factories. The South said that they had a right to nullify this tariff. They said that this tariff was unconstitutional. And because it was unconstitutional, they didn't have to obey it. That's why they said that they could nullify it. Jackson's vice president, who was John C. Calhoun, was from South Carolina. And Jackson's vice president says, look, you can either take that tariff away, you can get rid of it, or I'm going to have to quit. My people in South Carolina, they can't put up with this anymore. You can either get rid of it, or I'm going to quit. And he ends up resigning, and he's elected to the Senate in South Carolina. And the people of South Carolina say, John C. Calhoun, go back to the Senate, please, back to Washington, D.C., and fight this man. Make sure that this tariff gets taken care of. We can't live with this tariff. It's ruining our economy here in the South. The problem escalates. And that is that in the South, there's a growing number of people that are saying, look, if we don't get our way, if this doesn't change soon, we may have to form our own country. We may have to fight this out with the federal government, physically, with guns. And so Jackson sends a letter to a member of Congress. And he wants this member of Congress who's a loyal member to him. He says, I want you to tell them something. Tell them from me. Look, if they're going to continue to do this, they can talk about it all they want, But if they go so far as to shoot a gun at anybody who is representing the U.S. government and trying to collect those taxes, in defiance of the laws of the United States, he says, I'm going to hang them personally. I will come down there and I will kick some butt. You can be guaranteed that I will charge them with treason and they will get hung from the first tree that I can find. And so Jackson asks Congress to pass something called the Force Act. And that Force Act is basically a threat against the southern United States. Jackson says, because of the Force Act, I can use the U.S. military. And if you don't shape up, I'm going to bring the U.S. Army right down there. We're going to enforce those laws. He threatened to use the U.S. military against states to get the laws enforced. Now, South Carolina, remember, believes that they can nullify the law, meaning they don't have to obey it. And then they said, if that doesn't work, remember, then we don't have to really stay in the Union. We could secede from the Union for the United States, which means we get to leave. That doesn't mean physically leave. It means obviously to form your own country. But when Jackson makes this threat, the South begins to realize that it can't leave the Union without a fight. It's going to have to fight it out if they want to, in fact, make this work. And so the South takes a step back. Now remember, Jackson's not the kind of guy that says something and then doesn't mean it. Matter of fact, he's more so the kind of guy that if he says something, you better get out of his way because he probably means it. And so what this does, this regional division that's created by this tariff, by this conflict over the tariff, as well as the issues of nullification and secession, and that's what goes in these blanks here, just so you know. But this will eventually lead to civil war. Because remember that the issue of the Civil War was not a tariff. The issue of the Civil War was, in fact, slavery. But when the North began to outnumber the South in Congress and began to discuss the possibility of outlawing slavery, what did the South say? We won't obey those laws. We're going to nullify those laws. And we are not going to sit around and wait for you to enforce them. If you come upon us and try to enforce, we're going to secede. And then lo and behold, what happens in 1861 is that South Carolina pushes the button. South Carolina goes all the way and they say, well, this time, yep, we're going to fight. And the Civil War begins. So it's not over the same issue in the sense of, what causes them to say, we're going to nullify, we're going to secede. Here it's the tariff. There for the Civil War, it's slavery. But in this case, what we also notice is that in the Civil War, they don't sit around and go, well, maybe not a good idea. Partly because of the reason at the time they didn't have such a strong president and didn't think that they needed to worry about it. But the reality is that the Civil War begins because of these issues of nullification and secession. Now, Indian removal, we're going to change subjects entirely here. Indian removal is something very, very different. Starting in around 1831, 32, we have Jackson beginning to negotiate with states and have this discussion over what to do with the Indians. So this is in the early 1830s. And the main discussion is over what's to happen with the Indians, because the Indians, these American Indians, are sitting on valuable land. And this valuable land in various states, in particular in southern states like Alabama and Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina, Mississippi, this valuable land that the Indians are on, the Indians for the most part are not using. They live on it, they hunt on it, they don't do much else with it. And the people that are living near the Indians, of course, looking at the land going, whoa, wait a minute. The land that we're using to grow cotton, for instance, it's getting worn out. Cotton is very demanding on the soil. We could really use that Indian land. And then lo and behold, there's some gold discovered in Georgia on some Indian land. And Georgia makes a very big effort to get rid of the Indians. Jackson realizes something. As much as Jackson's an Indian fighter, Jackson has this kind of moment where he thinks very clearly about the situation. We could leave the Indians there. We could have this fight between the U.S. government and these Indians, or between the states and these Indians. And the Indians would probably be wiped out in the process. Then again, if we move them, we could save them. They would be out of our way, and we wouldn't come into conflict with them, and the Indians would survive. And there's, in fact, a letter that Jackson writes to the Congress and says very clearly, I'm worried about their extinction. I'm worried about the Indians being no more. We've got to move them, and we've got to get them off this land so that we can live in peace. The question is, where do you put them? So that's the when and the why. Now we got the where. And the where is this place called the Indian Territory. And the Indian Territory, if you look at the map, this is Texas, this is Louisiana, right? That means the Indian Territory is what we call today Oklahoma. They set aside Oklahoma as the Indian Territory. And they're going to send all the tribes, look at all the black lines on the screen, all these different tribes that are being sent over to the Indian Territory. Now, you might say, well, yeah, that'll help. They'll all be out of the way of American citizens who might come into conflict with them. But remember, they're different tribes because they have different cultures, because they don't get along with each other for the most part. They have their own territories, and now they're all being crammed into one place. This isn't such a good idea. But in any event, this is what we do. We put them into the Indian Territory. U.S. maps up until around 1880 did not have Oklahoma on them. Instead, that area north of Texas was referred to as the Indian Territory. And that is kind of a strange thing to see on some of those older maps from the mid-1800s. Now, one, I think, sort of big example of this movement is the Cherokee people. And if you look here, the Cherokee, which are here in northern Georgia, are going to be moved. And notice that the route is not exactly a straight line. Well, they've got to go around other tribes. They've got to go around populations of certain groups of people to avoid them. But the Cherokee are going to refer to this trip as the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee fought removal before they moved in court. And the Supreme Court said that because of the fact that the Cherokee had treaties with the United States, that they should stay on the land in Georgia. Now, Georgia is adamant they've got to be moved, and Jackson, remember, is in favor of this removal because there is a law that is passed called the Indian Removal Act. So Jackson ignores the decision. And in 1835, 15,000 Cherokee are going to be removed, and of those 15,000 that are moved, 4,000 of them will die in the process. Why? Well, it turns out that part of the agreement to move these Indians included military escort, for instance. It included blankets and food and wagons and horses. Except when the Indians were moved, the Cherokee were moved, and those materials, those supplies were supposed to get to the Indians, well, the U.S. government can't deliver that themselves, members of Congress, the president, etc. So they hire people called Indian agents to deliver these things to the Cherokee. Well, the Indian agents are given the money, and in some cases they didn't spend the money on the supplies and deliver it to the Indians, they ran with it, or if they were given the supplies, in some cases they were taking the supplies and selling the supplies and keeping the money. In other words, these people moved from northern Georgia to the Indian Territory on their own without supplies. So in the process, these 4,000 die because of starvation, because of freezing to death in the cold winter climate. And the ones that die primarily are the very old and the very young, the ones that are weakest. And this is a really tragic moment. But again, it's an example of how we did not make as much of an effort as we really should have to guarantee the safety of these people in the process of moving them. The Seminole, on the other hand, who lived in Florida, reacted very differently than the Cherokee because they lived in a place that was rather remote, Florida. It was more jungle and thick forest and swamps. They decided to fight it out. And the U.S. Army had to go in to get the Cherokee and remove them from Florida, and in the process, most of the Seminoles were killed. By 1842, there are very few Indians that remain east of the Mississippi River. So as you look at states like Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, all the way up into those middle and New England states, there really aren't very many Indians. The Indians have been moved all to the Indian Territory, or they're native people that live west of the Mississippi already, in places what we call Montana today, or Wyoming today, or Idaho today. But at the time were just big pieces of territory the U.S. owned, but really nobody lived there as far as American citizens. And so we really don't have any Indian problems to think about. Eastern part of the country, but when you get west of the Mississippi, this is when you could run into Indians after 1842, and you could run into some problems with Indians, depending on whose territory you're on. Certainly, the Indian Territory was not a place that anybody should go, because if you went through there, you probably wouldn't come out the other side safely. Now, again, we're going to change topics totally. We went from the election to the tariff of abominations to the Indian removal, and now we're going to talk about Jackson and the National Bank. We're almost done here, but this is the last big issue that we want to talk about. Andrew Jackson was not a person that really looked at the National Bank as something that people should participate in. He's going to very much agree with Thomas Jefferson when Thomas Jefferson said that it was sort of an abuse of government power because it was not something that was in the Constitution. So although it was declared constitutional by the Supreme Court, I think it was the Supreme Court case was McCulloch versus Maryland, he himself did not believe it was constitutional. And he says it doesn't benefit the common man, but instead it tends to benefit the wealthy. He claims it's run by powerful, big businesses. And so the situation with the National Bank is that the National Bank is run by a board of directors, most of which are businessmen, very big, powerful businessmen in the United States, and then some of which are government employees, but none of which are elected officials. None of which, if they make a decision that's bad, will be thrown out of that position and not be in charge of the bank because they're not elected. They're appointed and they sit there and they stay there. That's it, done. And Jackson says this is wrong. To have a bunch of wealthy people in charge of the bank and to have people that are appointed to that bank as government employees but never have to leave that bank and have to give that job to somebody else, none of which that are elected. He says none of these people respond to the common man. They're not out there trying to give loans to and help the average guy. They're helping the big businesses. They're helping these fat cats. That's why the big picture here on the left and right hand side. The fat cats in business, they're not helping the common man because they're not, the people that are sitting in control of the bank aren't common people. So Jackson wants to kill the National Bank. You can see a picture here representing Jackson with a sword fighting the National Bank, which is this kind of multi-headed beast that's attacking him. And then the guy behind him, by the way, he's got by the neck. That's the guy who actually is the head of the National Bank. So Jackson's on one hand, kind of strangling that guy, and on the other hand, fighting the beast that is the bank. Well, it turns out that the National Bank, which was passed by Congress during Washington's presidency and promoted by, of course, Alexander Hamilton, had a charter. And a charter basically meant that there was an expiration date on the bank. So the bank was good for, say, 10 years, and then Congress had to renew it. And it was good for 10 years, and then they had to renew it. Well, during Jackson's time as president, they got to renew it. And when the law comes up to renew the bank, Jackson vetoes it. And when he vetoes it, it doesn't die instantly. And the reason why it doesn't die instantly is because they actually went after the charter and tried to renew it the year before it was to expire, hoping that it would never really kind of end up in that situation where it was waiting for a renewal and whether it functions or not isn't a question. And so they did it a year in advance. Well, in the meantime, Jackson, once he's vetoed this law, knowing the bank's going to shut down, say 6-8 months later, he moves all the National Bank's money to these small state banks all over the United States. Well, these small state banks are under the control of either the states or they're their own businesses. They're operating as independent businesses. But he moves all that money to those banks. These small state banks loaned all that money out. They left very little for people to withdraw from the bank. If they walked in the front door and they wanted to pull their money out, well, there's not much there to pull out. You may have $10,000 in the bank, but the bank may only be able to give you, say, $1,000 of it. And if this kind of thing happens, well, the question is, what will you do? If you walk in and say, "I like $1,000," they say, "No, you can have 500. We haven't got enough money in our bank." Well, you might take your 500, but when you walk out the door, you're going to tell your friends, "Doggone it, the bank doesn't have my money." And they're going to go, "What? Yeah, they can only give me 500. I asked for 1,000." And then they're going to rush in and say, "Hey, we want our money back. I have $10,000. I want all my $10,000 back." "We can only give you 1,000. "What?" And they're going to tell their friends. We call this a panic. People begin to panic. Word spreads quickly. People rush to the banks. They withdraw all their money. They try and get as much out as they possibly can because they're concerned that the bank will not have it. And the banks go bankrupt. When the banks go bankrupt, the people that have taken loans from the bank, those loans are called back to the bank, meaning that the bank has the right to pull that loan out. At the time, this was a common right that banks had, that they could call your loan. They could say, "Sorry, time to pay it all off." Because why? "We haven't got any money and we need your money now." And of course, that means people begin to lose their farms, and this is a serious problem for the United States. So as this problem kind of escalates and spreads, over the course of a couple of years, the problem gets to the point where nobody wants to put their money in banks. No bank is able to make any loans. Nobody's buying property. Businesses are shutting down. People are becoming unemployed. And a few years later, we end up with a very severe depression. Now, in a depression, businesses and employment fall to very low levels. There's very few businesses. There's very few people that are employed. This particular chart is a chart of estimated unemployment from 1800 to 1890. The line you see here, I'm going to trace the line in orange just so you can see it better. This line is the average employment by decade. And notice that each one of these blocks, this is 1800 to 1810. This is the average employment, unemployment was at about, say, 2.5%. Very low unemployment. Then from 1810 to 1820, there was the same thing, very low unemployment, and then hiccup, and that right there is what we call a crisis. In other words, all of a sudden the unemployment spikes. It jumps up suddenly. And what's going on there? Well, notice what happens in 1838-39. The unemployment goes from about 2.5% to about 7.5%. There's this giant spike. Why? There's this depression that occurs. Why? Because there's this panic that occurs. Why? Because Jackson pulled the money out and put it in state banks. Why? Because he didn't like the national bank. Because he killed it. Now, does that mean the national bank was a good idea? There's still people that believe that the national bank was unconstitutional. There's also people that would say, and I think rightly so, that what Jackson did with the money, pulling it out and putting it in state banks, was probably unconstitutional. As president, he doesn't have power to move money around. That's Congress's job. But he did it anyways. But the weird thing is this. When this whole thing falls apart, 1838, 1839, Jackson's no longer president. He was no longer president in 1836. The panic happens a year after he's president. The depression happens a year or two later than that. The next president's the guy that ends up with the bad rap, not Jackson. Jackson's loved by the people. Now the question is, was Jackson really a man who looked out for the needs of the common man? Was he really a supporter of the common man? Did the tariff, I know it was called the tariff of abominations, but it was actually the tariff of 1828. Was that tariff good for the people? Was that tariff good for businesses? Was Indian removal a sample of how Jackson supported the common man? Was it moving the money? An example of how Jackson supported the common man. Being that the bank didn't loan to the common man, but only to the wealthy. The smaller state banks, well, they loaned to the common man, but they happened to loan a whole lot more than they should. So what is it with Jackson? You know, Jackson is one of the only presidents, I think he's the only president that ever paid off national debt. Jackson was incredibly popular. But Jackson, like most presidents, is also a flawed individual. So consider carefully how you might answer that question. And think carefully over really these three examples, the tariff, abominations, Indian removal, and the national bank, and what the impact might be there. But don't forget the spoil system. Because is the spoil system really an example of how Jackson supports the common man, or is he only supporting other people? Who may also be the common man, but happen to be his friends and supporters.